By this time, the Roman Empire had grown so powerful that it seemed impossible for any foreign force to overthrow it. But it was as if fortune, envious of the world's rulers, decided to turn Rome against itself. The earlier conflicts led by Marius and Cinna were just a warm-up, like a test run within the city. Then came the storm of Sulla, which extended further but still stayed within Italy. But the fury unleashed by Caesar and Pompey was like a massive flood or fire, sweeping through the city, Italy, other countries, and ultimately the entire empire. This wasn't just a civil war or a war with allies or even a foreign war. It was a combination of all these and something even more destructive. If you look at who was involved, the entire Senate was split between the two sides. In terms of military strength, one side had 11 legions and the other had 18, representing the best and strongest men in Italy. The allies also played a major role. On one side, there were troops from Gaul and Germany, and on the other, forces from places like Thrace, Cappadocia, Cilicia, Macedonia, Greece, Aetolia, and all the east. The war lasted 4 years, a relatively short time considering the devastation it caused. It started in Italy, spread to Gaul and Spain, then moved with full force to Epirus and Thessaly. From there, it suddenly shifted to Egypt, then Asia, then Africa, and finally circled back to Spain, where it came to an end. But the bitterness between the opposing sides didn't end with the war. The hatred of those who had lost continued until it was satisfied with the assassination of the victor right in the middle of the city and the Senate. The cause of this disaster was the same as with all others: too much good fortune. During the consulship of Quintus Metellus and Lucius Afranius, when Rome's power was at its peak, the city was celebrating recent victories over Pontus and Armenia in Pompey's theatres. Pompey's immense power, as often happens, stirred up envy among the idle citizens. Metellus, upset because his triumph over Crete was overshadowed, and Cato, who was always against those in power, began to criticize Pompey and turn public opinion against him. This resentment pushed Pompey to take harsher actions and seek support to protect his authority. At that time, Crassus was famous for his family, wealth, and honor, but he wanted even more power. Gaius Caesar was already well known for his eloquence, energy, and his rise to the consulship, yet Pompey still outshone them both. Caesar, eager for more distinction, Crassus wanting to increase his power, and Pompey aiming to add to his, all shared an equal desire for power. They quickly formed an alliance to take control of the government, working together, but each with his own ambitions. Caesar took control of Gaul, Crassus took Asia, and Pompey took Spain. With 3 massive armies, these 3 men now controlled the empire. Their rule lasted 10 years. At the end of this period, kept in check only by their fear of each other, a rivalry erupted between Caesar and Pompey after Crassus was killed by the Parthians and Julia, Pompey's wife, died. Her marriage to Pompey had kept a good relationship between the 2 men. Now, however, Pompey began to envy Caesar's growing power, and Caesar was offended by Pompey's prominence. Neither could tolerate an equal, and they fought for dominance as if the vast empire wasn't big enough for both of them. In the consulship of Lentulus and Marcellus, the alliance between Caesar and Pompey finally broke. The Senate, essentially controlled by Pompey, began to consider replacing Caesar in the consulship. Caesar, willing to step down if he was given fair consideration in the next election, found his request denied. Although 10 tribunes of the people, with Pompey's approval, had recently granted Caesar the consulship in his absence, now, with Pompey's neutrality, it was refused. The demand was that Caesar should return to Rome and formally apply for the position, as was the traditional practice. Caesar, however, insisted on receiving what had already been promised to him and declared that unless they kept their word, he would not disband his army. As a result, a decree was passed declaring Caesar an enemy of the state. Caesar, angered by these events, decided to claim victory through force. The first stage of this civil war unfolded in Italy, where Pompey had positioned small garrisons in strategic locations. However, they were quickly overrun by Caesar's sudden advance. The first battle signal came from Ariminium, where Libo was expelled from Etruria, Thermus from Umbria, and Domitius from Corfinium. The war might have ended without much bloodshed if Caesar had managed to catch Pompey at Brundusium. He nearly succeeded, but Pompey escaped by night through the blockaded harbour. It's almost embarrassing to say that Pompey, who had recently led the Senate and decided matters of peace and war, fled across the sea, over which he had once triumphed, in a single battered ship. Pompey wasn't driven out of Italy any faster than the Senate was forced to flee Rome. Caesar, upon entering a nearly deserted city where fear of him had emptied the streets, declared himself consul. When the tribunes hesitated to open the sacred treasury, he ordered it to be broken open, taking the wealth and resources of the Roman people before he took control of their empire. With Pompey on the run, Caesar decided it was wiser to secure the provinces before chasing him down. He secured Sicily and Sardinia, ensuring a steady supply of grain through his lieutenants. Gaul was already at peace, thanks to Caesar's earlier efforts. However, when Caesar tried to pass through Marseille on his way to confront Pompey's armies in Spain, the city shut its gates against him. This unfortunate city, wanting peace but afraid of war, ended up in conflict because of that fear. Since Marseille was well fortified, Caesar left it to be dealt with by his forces in his absence. Despite the city's Greek heritage, which often suggested a softer character, the people of Marseille bravely broke through enemy lines, set fire to Caesar's siege machines, and even engaged his forces at sea. But Brutus, who was in charge of the siege, defeated them both on land and at sea, ultimately subduing the city. When they finally surrendered, they lost everything except the one thing they valued most: their freedom. In Spain, Caesar faced a tough, unpredictable, and bloody struggle against Petreius and Afranius, Pompey's generals. They were camped near the town of Ilerda by the river Sicaris, and Caesar tried to besiege them and cut them off from the town. However, a spring flood caused the river to overflow, cutting off Caesar's own supply of provisions. His camp was soon suffering from hunger, and the besieger found himself nearly besieged. But when the river finally receded, it cleared the plains for battle and destruction. Caesar then aggressively pursued the enemy, and as they were retreating to Celtiberia, he trapped them with a blockade and a surrounding wall, cutting off their access to water. This forced them to surrender. With nearer Spain now secured, further Spain didn't hold out for long. After all, what could one legion do after 5 had already been defeated? Varro, seeing the situation, quickly surrendered, and with that, Cadiz, the Strait of Gibraltar, the ocean, and everything else acknowledged Caesar's superior fortune. However, in Illyricum and Africa, fortune seemed to test Caesar in his absence, perhaps to make his victories even more remarkable by throwing in some setbacks. Dolabella and Antony had been ordered to secure the entrance to the Adriatic Sea. Dolabella set up camp on the Illyrian shore, and Antony on the Curixian coast. But with Pompey controlling a vast expanse of the sea, Octavius Libo, Pompey's lieutenant general, suddenly surrounded both of them with a large force from his fleet. This led to Antony's forces being starved into surrender. Basileus attempted to send help by constructing some makeshift flatboats, as there were no proper ships available. However, these boats were caught in a net of ropes stretched underwater, a clever new tactic devised by the Cilicians in Pompey's service. 2 of the boats managed to escape thanks to the tide, but one, carrying some men from Opitergium, got stuck on the shallows. What happened next was a story worth remembering. A group of fewer than 1,000 men held off an entire surrounding army for a whole day. When they realized there was no way out, they chose, under the leadership of the tribune Vulteius, to avoid surrender by killing each other. In Africa, Curio's bravery was matched only by his bad luck. Sent to secure the province, he initially succeeded by defeating and routing Varus. But when King Juba and the Mauritanian cavalry suddenly arrived, Curio was unable to hold his ground. After his defeat, he could have fled, but his sense of shame drove him to die alongside the army that had been lost due to his rashness. With fortune now summoning the 2 main contenders for control of the world, Pompey chose Epirus as the battleground. Caesar, not one to delay, was quick to meet him. After securing everything behind him, he set sail in the middle of winter, despite the bad weather, to continue the war. He set up camp at Oricum, and, growing impatient because part of his forces, left with Antony due to a shortage of ships, were delayed at Brundusium, he decided to take matters into his own hands. In the dead of night, despite a raging storm, he attempted to sail across the sea alone in a small boat. When the boat's captain, terrified by the dangerous conditions, expressed his fear, Caesar famously told him, "What do you fear? You are carrying Caesar." When Caesar and Pompey had gathered their forces from all directions and set up their camps not far from each other, their strategies were vastly different. Caesar, naturally bold and eager to finish the conflict, displayed his troops and constantly provoked the enemy. He even tried to besiege Pompey's camp by surrounding it with a wall that stretched 16 miles. But what good was a siege when Pompey's camp had an open supply line from the sea? Caesar also launched fruitless attacks on Dyrrhachium, a place that was practically impregnable due to its location, and constantly engaged with Pompey's forces when they ventured out. During these skirmishes, the centurion Sceva showed extraordinary bravery. His shield was pierced by 120 weapons. Caesar also plundered cities that had sided with Pompey, devastating places like Oricum, Gomphi, and other strongholds in Thessaly. Pompey, on the other hand, chose to delay and avoid direct confrontation, hoping to wear down Caesar's forces, which were hemmed in and struggling with food shortages. His plan was to exhaust his impulsive opponent. However, this cautious strategy didn't last long. Pompey's soldiers grew frustrated with the inaction. The allies complained about the drawn-out war, and the nobility criticized Pompey's desire for power. Eventually, fate pushed him toward battle, and Thessaly was chosen as the battlefield. The destiny of Rome, the empire, and the entire world would be decided on the plains of Philippi. Never before had so many Roman forces and so much of Rome's dignity been gathered in one place. Over 300,000 men were assembled between the two armies, not counting the auxiliary troops provided by various kings and nations. The signs of impending doom were clear. Sacrificial animals escaped, swarms of bees settled on the military standards, and there was darkness in the middle of the day. Pompey himself had an ominous dream in which he heard applause in his theatre in Rome, which echoed in his ears like the beating of chests in mourning. To make matters worse, on the morning of the battle, he appeared in the middle of his army dressed in black, an unlucky omen. Caesar's army had never been more spirited and eager for battle. It was his side that first sounded the trumpets and launched the darts. The first javelin thrown in battle was by Crassus, whose fierce fighting was evident when he was later found among the enemy's dead, with a sword thrust through his mouth, a wound that showed just how intense and desperate his struggle had been. The outcome of the battle was astonishing. Despite Pompey having a much larger cavalry force, which seemed capable of easily surrounding Caesar, it was Pompey who ended up being hemmed in. After a long and evenly matched fight, Pompey's cavalry, at his command, charged forward from one of the wings. But Caesar's German cohorts, at a signal, suddenly countered with such a ferocious charge that it seemed as though the cavalry had turned into infantry, and the infantry advanced with the force of cavalry. The retreating cavalry's defeat led to the destruction of the light-armed foot soldiers. Panic spread rapidly among Pompey's troops, and as they fell into chaos, the rest of his army was slaughtered almost effortlessly. Ironically, the sheer size of Pompey's army contributed most to its downfall. Caesar played a pivotal role in the battle, acting as both a commander and a soldier. Some of his remarks during the fight were remembered. One, though harsh, was effective and helped secure the victory. "Soldiers, strike at their faces." Another, spoken during the pursuit, was intended to sound more merciful: "Spare your countrymen." As for Pompey, it would have been better for him, even in defeat, if he had died alongside his army. Instead, he outlived his honor, fleeing in disgrace on horseback through the Thessalian Tempe, eventually reaching Lesbos in a small vessel. He was then driven from Saedre and contemplated an escape to Parthia, Africa, or Egypt on a deserted rock in Cilicia. Finally, he met his tragic end on the shore of Pelusium, in front of his wife and children, at the order of a contemptible ruler, spurred on by eunuchs. Adding to his misery, he was killed by the sword of Septimius, a deserter from his own army. With the death of Pompey, who wouldn't have thought that the war was over? But the embers of the conflict in Thessaly flared up again, even more violently than before. In Egypt, a new war arose against Caesar, this time without any involvement from Roman factions. Ptolemy, the king of Alexandria, had committed the ultimate crime of the civil war, believing he could secure Caesar's friendship by presenting him with Pompey's head. However, fortune demanded justice for the death of such a great man, and the opportunity for retribution came quickly. Cleopatra, the king's sister, fell at Caesar's feet, pleading for a portion of the kingdom to be restored to her. She was beautiful, and her appeal was all the more powerful because, despite her charms, she seemed to have been wronged. Caesar had a strong dislike for her brother, Ptolemy, who had sacrificed Pompey to gain favour with Caesar's party, not out of loyalty to Caesar himself, and Caesar knew that Ptolemy would have likely treated him the same way if that had been in his interest. Wanting to restore Cleopatra to power, Caesar soon found himself besieged in the palace by the same people who had assassinated Pompey. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Caesar bravely held his ground with just a small force. First, he set fire to the nearby houses and shipyards to keep the enemy's darts at bay. Then he made a daring escape to the island of Pharos. When he was driven into the sea, Caesar swam to his nearby fleet, miraculously leaving his military cloak in the water, perhaps by accident or as a decoy to attract the enemy's darts and stones. Eventually, his fleet rescued him, and Caesar launched an attack on all sides, ultimately defeating the treacherous nation and avenging the death of his son-in-law. Theodotus, the king's guardian and the instigator of the war, along with Pothinus and Ganymede, monsters in human form, tried to flee across land and sea, but were hunted down and killed. The king's body was later found buried in the mud of the river, recognized by his golden coat of mail. In Asia, a new uprising emerged from Pontus. It was as if fortune had chosen this moment to bring an end to the kingdom of Mithridates, ensuring that just as the father was defeated by Pompey, the son would be defeated by Caesar. King Pharnaces, relying more on the Roman civil war than on his own strength, invaded Cappadocia with a battle-ready army. But when Caesar engaged him, he crushed Pharnaces in a single battle, so quickly and decisively that it was as if Caesar struck like lightning, arriving, striking, and disappearing all at once. Caesar wasn't exaggerating when he boasted, "The enemy was conquered before he was even seen." Such were Caesar's victories against foreign enemies, but in Africa he faced a fiercer battle against his own countrymen than he had at Pharsalia. The remnants of the defeated forces had regrouped there, but rather than being mere survivors, they formed a powerful new army. The disaster that had befallen Pompey only strengthened their loyalty, and the new leaders, Cato and Scipio, were formidable replacements for Pompey. Additionally, Juba, the king of Mauritania, joined their side, as if to extend Caesar's conquests even further. The battles at Pharsalia and Thapsus were similar, except that Caesar's forces fought with even greater intensity, angered that the war had continued after Pompey's death. In an unprecedented event, the trumpeters sounded the charge on their own, without waiting for the general's order. The battle began with the defeat of Juba's forces, whose elephants, unfamiliar with warfare and recently taken from the wild, were startled by the sudden noise, causing his army to flee. The leaders also attempted to escape, though their deaths were not without a certain dignity. Scipio fled by ship, but as the enemy caught up with him, he thrust his sword into his own belly. When someone asked where he was, he replied, "The general is well." Juba retreated to his palace, where he feasted lavishly the next day with Petreius, who had fled with him. In the midst of their drinking, Juba offered himself to be killed by Petreius. Petreius killed both Juba and himself, and the remains of their feast were mixed with the blood of a king and a Roman. Cato was not present at the battle, but had set up camp on the Bagrada River, guarding Utica as a final stronghold in Africa. When he heard of his side's defeat, he did not hesitate to die. As a wise man, he even welcomed death. After embracing his son and attendants and reading Plato's book on the immortality of the soul by the light of a lamp, Cato rested for a while. Around the first watch of the night, he drew his sword and stabbed himself in the chest multiple times. Although surgeons tried to treat his wounds, Cato endured their efforts until they left, then reopened the gashes himself. As a large amount of blood poured out, his hands grew weak, and he finally succumbed to his wounds. However, it was as if the real fighting had only just begun, with Pompey's forces rising once more. The struggle in Spain was even more intense than it had been in Africa, just as Africa had been fiercer than Thessaly. What drew significant attention to Pompey's side now was the fact that the two generals were brothers, two Pompeys instead of one. As a result, the battles were fiercer than ever, and the outcomes were more uncertain. First, Varus and Didius, the lieutenant generals, clashed right at the mouth of the ocean. But their ships faced a greater battle against the sea than against each other. The ocean, as if punishing the civil discord between fellow citizens, destroyed both fleets in a massive shipwreck. It was a terrifying scene. Waves, storms, men, ships, and weapons all clashing together in a chaotic mix. The setting itself added to the horror. The shores of Spain on one side and Mauritania on the other seemed to close in, with the Mediterranean and Atlantic seas meeting, and towering pillars of Hercules looming, all while a battle raged amid a violent tempest. Soon cities paid the penalty for their allegiance to Rome under these opposing leaders as they were sieged by both sides. The final contest was at Munda. Here, unlike his usual success, Caesar faced a doubtful and grim battle, as if fortune itself was deliberating. Before the battle, Caesar wasn't acting like his usual self. It might have been because he was feeling vulnerable, perhaps due to his long streak of success, or because he was now in the same position Pompey once held. During the battle, something unusual happened. The two armies, equally matched, fought fiercely, but neither side gained any ground. Suddenly, a deep silence fell over them, as if they had all agreed to pause, and everyone seemed to be thinking the same thing. How long will this go on? For Caesar, something shocking occurred, something he'd never seen before. After 14 years of proven service, his veteran soldiers started to fall back. They didn't flee outright, but seemed less ashamed of retreating than proud of showing real courage. In a frenzy, Caesar jumped off his horse, rushed to the front lines, and started grabbing the fleeing soldiers, steadying the standard-bearers, and pleading, encouraging, and scolding them as he darted around, using his eyes, hands, and voice to rally his troops. Amid the chaos, Caesar even thought about death, seemingly ready to embrace it. But then he noticed 5 cohorts of the enemy charging across the field, sent by Labienus from the besieged camps as a last resort. This looked like a retreat to Caesar, or maybe he just seized the opportunity as a clever leader, pretending they were already fleeing enemies. This move demoralized the opponents and rallied his own men, who started fighting harder, thinking they were winning. Meanwhile, Pompey's men began to flee, thinking their side was losing. The fury and rage with which Caesar's men slaughtered the enemy were intense. Those who fled to Munda were immediately seized by Caesar's orders. A rampart was made out of the piled-up corpses, held together by javelins and darts, a sight that would have horrified even barbarians. In desperation, Pompey's sons, with Gnaeus fleeing wounded from the battle, sought refuge in remote areas. Caesonius caught up with Gnaeus at the town of Lauro, where Gnaeus, still fighting despite his injuries, was killed. Sextus, on the other hand, was hidden by fortune in Celtiberia, surviving to fight another day after Caesar. Caesar returned to Rome victorious. His first triumph was for Gaul, showcasing the Rhine, the Rhone, and the conquered ocean made of gold. The second was for Egypt, featuring the Nile, Arsinoe, and a model of the burning Pharos. The third was for Pharnaces and the Pontus. The fourth celebrated his victories over Juba, Mauritania, and twice conquered Spain. Notably absent were Pharsalus, Thapsus, and Munda, though these were among his greatest achievements. Finally, peace followed, free from bloodshed, and Caesar's clemency was a way to atone for the war. Only Afranius, who had been pardoned once before, Faustus Sulla, who Pompey had taught his son-in-law to fear, and Pompey's daughter with her children were executed as a warning to future generations. The Romans showed their gratitude by bestowing all kinds of honours on Caesar, statues in temples, a special crown for the theatre, a raised platform in the Senate, a pinnacle on his house, a month in the calendar named after him, and the titles of Father of his Country and Perpetual Dictator. Finally, whether he wanted it or not, the symbols of kingship were offered to him by Consul Antony at the rostra. But all these honours were like decorations on a sacrificial victim marked for death. Envy overcame Caesar's kindness, and his power, even though used for good, was too much for the Roman spirit to bear. It wasn't long before Brutus, Cassius, and other senators conspired to kill him. Despite being warned of the conspiracy on the very day it was to happen, and despite the ominous signs during his sacrifices, Caesar couldn't avoid his fate. He went to the Senate anyway, planning his next campaign against the Parthians. There, as he sat in his chair, the Senate attacked him, and he was brought down with 23 wounds. In the end, the man who had spilled so much blood in civil war finally filled the Senate house with his own.